So, have any of you heard of a gentleman by the name of Henry Ford? Okay. Well, in 1912, he visited a town in Ireland called Cork because of his Irish roots and the potential for the city to become a manufacturing hub for one of his auto buildings manufacturing plants. His visit was part of a broader strategy to establish that Ford manufacturing center in Europe, especially after the outbreak of World War I. And if you know your history, 1912 was about the time that everyone engaged in that war. And he knew that there would be a need for tractors during the war to help deliver food to areas where it may not have normally gotten. And his visit to Cork was significant because it marked the beginning of Ford plant's operation in Ireland, which would become the largest Ford employer outside of the United States. Now, the story goes that while he was staying in Cork, a couple of trustees of the local hospital paid him a call. Here's how that conversation went. Mr. Ford, we're building a hospital here in Cork, and we think it would be a marvelous memorial to your dear departed father who left his native land for the fair shores of America if you would make a gift to support this worthy endeavor. And so Henry Ford took out his checkbook. He handed over a check for £5,000 on the spot. The next morning, however, he opened the local newspaper and saw the banner headline that said, you ready for this? American millionaire gives $50,000 to local hospital. Well, Mr. Ford wasted no time in contacting those two hospital trustees, and he waved that newspaper in their faces saying, what's the meaning of this? To which they responded, well, Mr. Ford, we apologize. It's such a regrettable error, but not to worry, we can fix it. We'll get the editor to print a retraction in the very next edition, declaring that the great Henry Ford has given not 50,000, but 5. Imagine Ford's dismay. He pulled out his checkbook, he wrote a check for £45,000 and handed it to the apologetic trustees. But he didn't let go of it. He said, I'm making this further gift under one condition. You must erect a marble arch at the new hospital entrance and place upon it a plaque that contains the verse from the Bible that says, I was a stranger and you took me in. So the question that arises out of this story is, did Henry Ford truly give the £45,000 from the depths of his heart and in the interest of the hospital, or did he do it because he was guilted into it? And I also wonder how many of us have ever had something like this happen to us, where when presented with an opportunity to give to a worthy cause, we pull out a $5 bill when there's plenty of 20s in our wallet as well. One of the things that really amazes me about this story is that here we have a very wealthy man who becomes even wealthier because of this trip, giving what could have been considered a very minor amount of money to a very worthy cause. But because of the shrewdness of those hospital trustees, he ended up giving a more substantial amount. The other thing that amazes me is how much this modern day story really reflects what I think Jesus is trying to tease out of the parable before us this morning from Luke's gospel. The other thing that amazes me, can you tell this story really bothers me? The other thing that amazes me is that Jesus speaks about money, its use, its worship, and its improper use more than any other topic. And yet, we avoid talking about money in church, don't we? Okay, good. I'm glad to hear you say that. But here's the breakdown. According to one theological analysis, my brain is moving too fast for my mouth, forgive me. According to one theological analysis that I read this past week, Jesus speaks about money 88 times in Matthew, 54 times in Mark, and 92 times in Luke. And he told 16 out of his 38 parables about the proper and improper use of material possessions. So why are we so afraid about talking about money here? Here's the thing that comes to mind for me at this time. I have to wonder if it's because modern day people do not like it when we bring up the idea that we might be misusing the gifts of God. And that was the real ouch moment for me this past week. Here's what I want you to hear very clearly before you totally tune me out at this point. Money is an important aspect of our lives. The management of it is something that God considers to be of utmost importance in our spiritual lives. Otherwise, it would not appear more than 2,000 times in our Bibles. Let me say that again. The concept and topic of money appears more than 2,000 times in our Bibles. While that sinks in for a moment, I want you to consider whether or not we are truly good stewards of all that we're given in this 21st century world. Now, the story that Jesus tells us this morning is hard for us to interpret. And it's for many reasons, but I think the primary reason is because it seems that Jesus is applauding bad behavior, right? And we don't normally hear him doing that. And I know I usually get caught up in that verse in which the rich man commends the manager for discounting the debts owed to him. And the reason I get so caught up in it is partly because of my bookkeeping and accounting background, right? That doesn't make sense to me from a practical perspective. I mean, if you think about it, which of your debtors would agree to let you pay less than what you owe? Zero, exactly. And if any of you have been in a situation of being underwater in debt, you know that in order to pay off that debt, you often need to negotiate long and hard to get those debts reduced or forgotten. And oftentimes, having been there myself, it's a hardship to try and get that point. But it also is a hardship to what that did to my credit as a result. And having to fight long and hard to get my credit to a point where I could receive credit now. But taking this one step further, the wealthy man did not punish the manager for negotiating these reduced debts, but rather applauded him for being shrewd, which means, and the word shrewd means having or showing sharp powers of judgment or being astute. If you think about it, that's a pretty adept and apt description of the manager in Jesus' story for today, right? I mean, he showed some really astute judgment about being able to provide for his future. He says, the manager thought to himself, now what? My boss has fired me, I don't have the strength to dig ditches, and I'm too proud to beg. Sounds like something I could say. He says, I know how to ensure that I'll have plenty of friends who will give me a home when I am fired. Now, it seems to be that his ulterior motive in this whole concept and idea is to protect his own livelihood and ability to survive. Right? Would you agree with me on that assessment? Okay. The thing is that when Jesus has spoken about money in previous parables, and especially about what it means to be a good steward, he has always promoted using our gifts in a way that brings glory to God first. Right? Would you agree with me on that statement? Okay, good. Whew. I'm making sense. That's a good thing. Here, though, it does not seem that the manager is doing this. Or am I the only one seeing that? I'm hoping I'm not the only one that's totally confused by this parable. To be perfectly honest, all of the scholars that I read this past week agree with us that it's confusing to hear Jesus speak this way. And so I have to wonder, what do we do with this story if it confounds us so much? So let's take a little bit of context here and see if this helps us to put it in perspective. Part of our story still is happening near or even in the home of that Pharisee from a few weeks ago. Remember that story? In which Jesus had been eating at the table with the Pharisees and telling them different things. At least that's the presumption that most of the scholars make based on what I was reading. Which means he's also surrounded not only by those crowds of people that are following him around, he is still being followed by the Pharisees and the scribes. We are definitely in his final days or weeks before his death and resurrection, which means that he's likely thinking in terms of what it means for those who will follow him after his death. What do they need to know most in the coming days? And it seems to me that Christ's story is meant to cut at the heart of who the Pharisees and the scribes see themselves being. And he's trying to address a concern that still exists today: the disparity between the rich and the poor. And this is where I think we need to focus the remainder of our time this morning. And so as we consider this story, the disparity between the rich and the poor is just as prevalent today as it was back then, right? The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and us in the middle class are stuck somewhere in the middle, likely moving more towards the poor side, right? The difference today, though, is that I think many of our wealthy in this world hide behind the idea that they would not be as rich as they are if God did not want them to be. And I have to admit that while that sounds like good justification, it is really just that. It's a justification as to why they can do what they want when they want for however much they want. I also have to admit that I cringe every time that I've heard someone come to me and say, "Pastor, I am only this rich because God wanted me to be." The reason why they don't need to help those less fortunate, or say that they give, but I give a tithe. Here's the thing, and I go back to our story about Henry Ford at the beginning. If Henry Ford really cared about the hospital in Cork, he would have given the $50K to start with. Don't you agree? I know that sounds really harsh, but I really think that is what Jesus needed for those around him to hear in this story. He needed them to remember that no matter how much money you have or do not have, we need to think about the ministry that is needed. We need to consider where we can take a hit ourselves in our budgets to be able to help those who are not as fortunate as ourselves. That is, after all, our calling in this world. What I'm seeing in this story is kind of a satire of what the wealthy seem to have always done: hoard their money to make sure they can take care of themselves. But here's what one of the books I read this week said, and I think it says it far better than I could ever come up with. In this parable, the manager is capable of saving his job and gaining friends, but that will not save him from his disreputable actions. The manager spends his energy on self-serving actions. In further irony, these actions are rewarded by the manager's master because the master, too, seems to be a person interested in riches. Yet Jesus wants us to know that we must worship God rather than our money. And the end of this particular lesson makes that clear. We cannot worship God and money. Because if we do, at some point, we are going to be called to account and end up resenting one or the other. As contemporary Christians, we all have to come to terms with our relationship to the wealth that we have been given to use. Our issues are not whether or not we will have any wealth, but in what ways the wealth we have can serve others and serve the purposes of God's reign, rather than be loved for what it brings to us. Amen?